My name is Nora Walsh. I am 33 years old. On a Sunday afternoon in April, I sat in the living room of a house in Scottsdale in Arizona, while my mother-in-law stood in the center of the room in front of 19 family members and placed a small silver device on the coffee table. She said she had something she needed everyone to hear. She said she had been patient for 6 months. She said the recording would explain everything. She pressed play. The room was completely quiet, and then, for 4 minutes and 37 seconds, everyone in that room heard exactly what had been happening in that house for the last 6 months. It was not what Miriam Walsh had intended them to hear. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before I tell you what came out of that speaker, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to SoftStormStories. Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from. I read every single one. Now let me take you back 18 months, to the October evening that my husband's mother moved into our best room for what she called a temporary stay, and what turned out to be something considerably more permanent than that. I live in a 2-bedroom apartment in Tempe, Arizona. I moved here 8 months ago. The bedroom faces east, and in the mornings the light through the window is clean and direct, and I have learned to wake with it instead of fighting it. I keep a small succulent on the kitchen windowsill. It was a housewarming gift from my colleague Dina, given the day I moved in, with a card that said, "These survive everything." I have watered it every Sunday morning since. I am a licensed clinical social worker. I have practiced for 7 years, the last 4 at a family services agency in Mesa, where I run a caseload of 23 families in crisis intervention. My work requires me to observe behavior carefully, to document what I see with precision, and to remain composed in rooms where other people are not composed. I am good at all 3 of these things. I did not always know how useful they would be at home. I keep a small leather notebook in my bag, not a journal, a professional log I have kept since my 2nd year of practice. My supervisor, Dr. Angela Reed, gave me the first one and said, "Write down what you observe, not what you feel. Feelings change. Observations don't." I have filled 11 of them. My husband, Connor Walsh, is 35. We met when I was 27 and married when I was 29 in a small ceremony in Sedona with 41 people and a meal that my mother made from scratch. Connor is a structural engineer. He is precise and good-humored and genuinely kind in the particular kind of people who have not had to work at kindness because it came naturally. His mother, Miriam Walsh, is 63, widowed, and lived alone in Scottsdale since her father died 4 years before we married. Miriam is the kind of woman who weaponizes warmth. She greets everyone with both hands and a smile that arrives first and does the work of establishing a territory before any words are said. She's generous in ways that create debt, gifts that require gratitude of a specific kind, help that establishes obligation. She had opinions about our apartment, our furniture, our food, our schedule, and our plans for children, and she delivered these opinions with the particular gentleness of someone who considered directness a form of caring. Connor managed her in the way that children manage difficult parents when they have been managing them their whole lives, automatically, without noticing the management, without understanding that what looks like patience from the outside is actually an architecture of small surrenders. She moved into our guest room in October, 14 months after our wedding. She said it was temporary. She said her knee needed surgery and the recovery required help. Connor said yes before I had finished hearing the question. I said, of course. I meant it. What I did not account for was what temporary meant to Miriam Walsh. 3 weeks became 6. 6 became 3 months. The knee healed, the stay continued. By month 4, I understood that the guest room had become something else in Miriam's mind, a position, a foothold, a permanent arrangement that nobody had agreed to, but that had assembled itself out of small increments, the way these arrangements always do. She organized the kitchen, she commented on my work schedule, she told Connor things about me with the structure of observations rather than criticisms, the way you say, "I noticed," instead of "I think," to make an opinion sound like a fact. The wound came in month 5. I had come home from a particularly difficult day. A family I had been working with for 8 months had reached a crisis point that required an emergency placement, and I had been on the phone and in meetings for 11 consecutive hours. I came home at 9 p.m. The kitchen had been rearranged. My spice rack, which I had organized by frequency of use over 4 years, had been reordered alphabetically. A small thing. I know it was a small thing. I put my bag down. I stood in the kitchen. I breathed. I put the spices back where they belonged. Miriam came in while I was doing it. She said, "I was just trying to help." I said, "I know." She said, "You seem stressed. Connor worries about you." I said, "I'm fine, Miriam." She looked at me with the expression she used when she was preparing to say something that would be framed as concern. She said, "I wonder sometimes if the job is too much. You bring it home. I can see it. Connor sees it too." She paused. "A woman should be able to leave work at work." I looked at her. I said, "Thank you for reorganizing." I picked up my bag and went to the bedroom. I remember the sound of the refrigerator humming and the particular stillness of a kitchen that had been changed in a way that was designed to remind me I was not the only person who lived there. I did not shout. I did not cry. I opened my leather notebook and I wrote down what she had said, the time, the date, and what I had observed about her expression and body language when she said it. Old habit. Dr. Reed's voice in my head. Write down what you observe, not what you feel. So I worked. I continued my caseload. I supervised 2 junior workers. I completed my continuing education hours. I presented at a family services conference in Phoenix in January and was cited in a state-level policy brief in February. I also continued living in a house where Miriam Walsh was rewriting the story of who I was, one conversation at a time, in the room with my husband where I was not present to hear it. Connor told me about the conversations gradually, in the way that people share things they are processing themselves, a word here, a detail there, the shape of it emerging over weeks. His mother was concerned about my hours. His mother had noticed I seemed withdrawn. His mother thought I was carrying something I wasn't talking about. Each piece was reasonable in isolation. Together they formed a portrait of a woman who was struggling in ways her husband should be worried about. I recognized the technique. I use it in my clinical work when I am trying to understand what a family believes about itself. I did not confront Miriam. I did not raise it with Connor. I continued to write in the notebook. I continued to be exactly who I was in every room I was in, and to let the record be the record. What Miriam had done, beginning in November, was place a small audio recording device in the living room of our home. She told me this herself eventually, though not in the way she intended. The device was a voice-activated model purchased from an electronics store in Scottsdale. She had positioned it behind a ceramic vase on the bookshelf that I had always found slightly out of place and had always moved back and never thought to examine. For 6 months it recorded everything that happened in that living room. A colleague of mine named James Park, he was a family law attorney who had referred cases to my agency for 3 years and who I trusted specifically because he was precise without being cold, called me in March. He said he had been contacted by a friend of Miriam's who wanted advice on a family situation. He said the friend had described recording a household member without their consent and wanted to know if the recordings could be used in a family court proceeding. He said he needed more information. The friend had provided it. James had recognized my name. He had called me immediately. He said, "Nora, I think your mother-in-law has been recording your home." I said, "Tell me what you know." He did. I said, "Can I come to your office tomorrow?" He said yes. I met with James on a Thursday morning for 90 minutes. He explained the legal landscape with the clarity of someone who had been explaining legal landscapes to people in difficult situations for 22 years. In Arizona, recording a conversation without the consent of at least one party is a violation of state wiretapping law. Miriam was a party to some conversations, but not all. There were hours of recordings in which she was not present. The device had captured private conversations between Connor and me, conversations between me and my mother on the phone, conversations between me and my professional colleagues when I occasionally took calls in the living room. James said, "The recordings are potentially inadmissible and potentially illegal depending on what's on them." I said, "She's planning to use them at a family meeting." He said, "What kind of family meeting?" I said, "The kind she's been building toward for 6 months." He said, "Do you want to know what's on them?" I said, "No, but I want you there when she plays them." Miriam organized the Sunday gathering with 2 weeks' notice. She invited 19 family members, Connor's aunts, cousins, his grandmother, 2 family friends. She did not tell Connor the specific purpose. She said it was a spring gathering. She said she had something she wanted to share. Connor asked me what I thought it was. I said I had some idea. He asked if I was all right. I said yes. I almost said no to going. James called me the evening before and said, "Whatever she plays, let the room hear it in full. Don't stop it." I said, "I know." He said, "The recording will do more work than you can do." I said, "I'm counting on that." I could have gone to Connor the night before and told him everything. Instead, I let it reach the room where it could be witnessed. That's exactly why I went. I wore a simple navy wrap dress and flat sandals, nothing that announced anything. I put on my grandmother's ring, small gold band, no stone, given to me on my wedding day with the words, "For when you need to remember what steady feels like." I put the leather notebook in my bag, not to use, just to have it. Miriam's house in Scottsdale was the kind of house that had been decorated for the purpose of being admired, curated, maintained, every surface carrying an object placed there by intention. 19 family members distributed through the living room and into the dining room and out onto the back patio in the April warmth. Miriam, near the fireplace, in a cream blouse and pressed slanks, holding a glass of iced tea, the particular composure of a woman who had prepared thoroughly for a specific outcome. Connor's Aunt Sandra found me near the kitchen and said, "Do you know what this is about?" I said, "I have a sense." She looked at me carefully. She said, "Are you okay?" I said yes. She believed me because I meant it. Connor's cousin Mark came next. He was 31 and had always been the family member who defaulted to Miriam's position on everything. He said, "Miriam said this was important. I hope everything is okay with you two." I said, "Everything is fine, Mark." He nodded without conviction and moved away. James had come as my guest. I had introduced him to Connor 2 weeks earlier as a professional colleague and friend, which he was. He stood near the back wall with the specific stillness of an attorney in a room where evidence was about to be presented. He had asked me whether I wanted to review the recordings before the meeting. I had said no. I had said I trusted what was on them. He had said, "I've listened to 6 months of recordings, Nora. You should know you were exactly who you are." I held the notebook in my hand for a moment after he said that. Then I put it in my bag. Miriam called the room to attention at 2:30. She tapped her iced tea glass. The room settled. She spoke about family, about the importance of honesty, about how much she loved her son and how much she wanted the best for him. She spoke for several minutes. She was composed and warm and entirely prepared. Then she placed the small silver recording device on the coffee table. She said, "I've been watching things in this household for 6 months. I want everyone to hear what I've heard." She said it looking at me. "This is for Connor's benefit, for the family's benefit." She pressed play. The recording began. It was a Tuesday evening in December. Miriam was in the kitchen. Connor and I were in the living room talking about a difficult case I had handled that day. I was describing the situation in the general terms I always used, protecting confidentiality. I sounded tired. I sounded like someone at the end of a long day talking honestly with her husband. Then Connor said something to me, quiet, specific, the kind of thing people say when they have been paying attention. He said, "You're doing good work, Nora. I see it." I said, "Thank you." That was the clip. The next clip began. It was a Thursday in January. Miriam was not in the living room. I was on the phone with my mother. My mother was asking about the house. I said Miriam was still there and that it was complicated. My mother said, "How does Connor feel?" I said he doesn't see it the way I do. I said, "I'm managing it." My mother said, "You always manage it. That's not the same as it being okay." I said, "I know." There was a pause. Then my mother said, "Is she kind to you?" I said, "Not always." That was the clip. The room was very quiet. The next clip began. It was February, a Saturday afternoon. I was not present. Connor was in the living room. Miriam came in. She said to Connor, "I'm worried about Nora. I think she's struggling and she won't tell you." Connor said, "She seems fine to me, Mom." Miriam said, "That's what I mean. She hides things. I've been watching." Connor said, "What do you mean by watching?" Miriam said, "Just paying attention." Connor's voice shifted. He said, "What does that mean?" Miriam said, "I've been keeping notes." Connor said, "Notes on my wife?" Miriam said, "For your benefit." Connor was quiet for 4 seconds. Then he said, "Mom, stop." The room was completely still. The device kept playing. There were 11 more clips. They all sounded roughly the same. Me living my life, tired sometimes, honest sometimes, professional, occasionally irritated, never cruel, never dishonest, never anything that supported the portrait Miriam had been constructing. And there were 3 more clips of Miriam speaking to other family members about me in this house in the weeks before this gathering, building the case she had planned to make today. One clip was from a conversation with Connor's aunt Sandra. Miriam's voice said, "I worry she doesn't want children because of her work. She's too clinical, too detached." The aunt said, very carefully, "I think Nora seems fine, Miriam." James set down his water glass. He looked at Miriam. He said, "Mrs. Walsh, my name is James Park. I'm a family law attorney. I've reviewed these recordings in full, and I need to inform you and everyone in this room that several hours of this device's recordings were captured without the knowledge of all parties present, which under Arizona Revised Statute 13-3005 constitutes a potential wiretapping violation." He paused. "I'd also note that the recordings appear to document the recordist engaging in a pattern of statements about a third party to family members in that party's absence, which is relevant context for how this material was gathered and why I'd recommend stopping the playback." No one moved for 4 seconds. Then Connor stood up. He looked at his mother. He said, "You put a recording device in my house." Miriam said, "I was worried." "You put a recording device in my house." He said it again, the same way, not louder, just again. Miriam's mouth opened. Nothing came out. I stood up. I did not look at Miriam. I looked at Connor, and I spoke clearly and without performance. I said, "I'm going to go home now. I'll talk to you tonight." I picked up my bag. I looked at James. "Thank you for being here." He nodded. I walked to the front door. 19 people watched me leave. The door opened onto the April afternoon in Scottsdale, bright, warm, the particular clarity of a desert spring day. I walked to my car. I sat in it for 4 minutes with my hand on the steering wheel. Then I drove home. James called me the following morning. He had stayed until the end of the gathering. He told me that after I left, Connor had asked everyone to go home, that most people had left quickly and without saying much, that Sandra had hugged Miriam and then walked out without speaking to her, that Mark had tried to say something about context, and that Connor had looked at him and he had stopped, that Miriam had tried twice to restart the recording, and that Connor had picked up the device and put it in his pocket, that Connor had sat in the living room alone for a long time after everyone left. James said, "He called me that night." I said, "I know. We talked." James said, "He's processing." I said, "He is." James said, "Are you all right?" I said, "Yes." I meant it. Miriam sent a card 10 days after the gathering, 4 paragraphs in her careful handwriting. The first 3 were explanation. The 4th said she hoped I would understand that she had only ever wanted to protect her son. There was no sentence that functioned as an apology. There was one sentence about love located near the end, placed in a way that made it feel like a closing argument rather than a feeling. I read it once. I put it in the drawer under my notebook. James and Connor had the real conversation on a Monday evening 3 days after the gathering, at the kitchen table with the window open. It lasted 2 hours. It was the most honest conversation we had had in the 18 months of his mother's stay. He said he had not known about the device. I said I knew. He said he had not known how much had been said to him without his examination. I said I knew that, too. He said, "I've been managing her my whole life, and I stopped seeing it as management." I said, "I know." He said, "I'm sorry." I said, "I know you are." We sat there for a while after that, in the particular quiet of a marriage that has said something true and is deciding what to do with it. I called my mother that evening after Connor went to sleep. She answered on the first ring. I told her about the gathering and about the recordings and about Connor at the kitchen table. She was quiet until I finished. Then she said, "The recording of us, what did it sound like?" I said, "Like 2 women who love each other talking honestly." She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Good, that's exactly what it was." I was at my desk. The succulent on the windowsill was in the lamplight. I held my grandmother's ring on my finger. Something moved through me briefly, quietly. I said, "I know, Mom." She said, "Are you home?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Good, stay there." I said, "I am." Miriam did not return to our house after the gathering. She stayed in Scottsdale. Connor called her weekly. The calls were shorter than they used to be and more honest, which made them better even when they were difficult. Miriam sent Christmas cards. She sent a birthday card for mine in February. She did not send anything that contained an apology, but the cards were warm in a way that felt like an attempt, and I accepted the attempt for what it was. James confirmed that no formal legal action was taken. The device had captured enough party-present conversations for miscusion to be uncertain, and Connor and I chose not to pursue it. What we chose instead was simpler. We moved to our own space, established our own rhythm, and stopped sharing a house with a woman who needed to manage what she could not control. I am still at the Family Services Agency.
Last month, I was appointed clinical director, overseeing a team of 7 social workers and a caseload of 93 families. I still keep the leather notebook. The 12th one is on my desk. I still write down what I observe, not what I feel. Dr. Reed was right. Feelings change, observations don't. The recording device, inadvertently, had produced 11 notebooks worth of observation in 4 hours and 37 minutes. I did not plan that, but I was not surprised by it either. People who surveil others to build a case against them tend to capture more of themselves than they intended. I started co-facilitating a support group this spring for people navigating difficult in-law dynamics. People who are living inside situations that are hard to name and harder to prove. We meet every other Thursday at a community center in Tempe. 9 people came to the first session, 14 to the second. I bring the leather notebook. I tell them what Dr. Reed told me. Write down what you observe. Date it. The record matters. The record is the thing that stays true when everything else is being revised. The succulent is still on the kitchen windowsill. It has 3 new leaves since February. Here is what I know. The people who surveil us to prove we are something we are not are making a fundamental error about the relationship between observance and truth. They believe that watching long enough will produce evidence for the conclusion they have already reached. What they do not understand is that sustained observation of an honest person produces only more evidence of honesty. The record they are building is always the record of themselves. You do not need to defend against that kind of surveillance. You only need to keep being who you are while it's running. If this story reminded you that the record of your ordinary, honest life is the most powerful evidence you have, share it with someone who needs to hear that today. Subscribe to Soft Storm Stories, and I'll see you in the next one.